Okay. And he said something about...
Yep, we're live.
Great.
Okay, greetings everybody. Welcome to the speaker series for the Algorithmic Bias Project. This week we have Professor Stephen Coyne talking to us about probability talk and the wrongs of discrimination.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'll just mention, first of all, thanks for having me. So this is a work in progress. It's the first time it's seen the light of day. So I'm really looking forward to your comments. So just to set up, the discrimination is like a pretty contested concept, especially a lot of people tend to divide it in terms of how it's defined and then sort of when it's wrongful. And so the standard way of just purely defining discrimination is something like the differential treatment or consideration of persons on the basis of their membership in a socially salient group. So what I'm going to talk about in my talk today, actually, where's a good place for me to stand? I'm kind of blocking this slides, aren't I?
Just bear with me.
Okay, let's get this set up maybe a little like this. Okay.
Yeah, you can step to the side because they can see your slides. So.
Great, yeah, this should work a little better.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's discrimination kind of writ large. I'm going to focus on one particular kind of discrimination, and so that's discrimination that happens on the basis of true statistics about groups. So a lot of people say, look at, say there's a decision about who to hire, and so one consideration that an employer might make is women are more likely than men to take paternal leave. And so it seems pretty plausible. Most people would say that there's something wrongful about using that fact as a basis for making an employment decision. And so what we're going to think through today is why that might be wrongful. And so what I'm going to do is kind of draw on some ideas from philosophy of language and philosophy of statistics to at least give a new mechanism by which that might be wrongful. So I'm going to start off just by talking about some theories of why decision-making on the basis of true statistics might be discriminatory. Then I'm going to turn to the more like new stuff. Most of what I'm going to do in part one is just kind of surveying the terrain already. In part two, I'm going to get into how philosophy of statistics and philosophy of language might bear on this problem. So what I'm going to argue basically is that there's various drivers that lead statistical statements or statistical claims to be interpreted in different ways. In particular, they're going to drive to interpreting them kind of as propensities rather than purely as frequencies. In part three, I'm going to argue that drift happens in all the paradigmatic cases of decision-making, or at least a lot of them, and that helps to explain some of the wrongfulness of discrimination in cases like the one I just mentioned. And finally, then I'll just zoom back, kind of take the mechanisms I've developed in part two and part three, and try to relate them back to the terrain of discrimination. Okay, so part one, just laying out the terrain of these cases of these discrimination or putative discrimination on the basis of true statistics. So again, we'll work with this as our kind of paradigm example, although there's many other kinds of examples too. So women are more likely than men to take parental leave. It's a fairly well-established fact, but at the same time, again, we tend to think that there's likely something wrongful about relying on that in decision-making. So if we were to kind of spell this out a little more as an inference applied to a particular applicant, it might go something like this. So say Kristen is a woman, Rohit is a man. We've got our statistical premise here. Women are more likely than men to take parental leave. And so you can infer from that, Kristen in particular is more likely than Rohit to take parental leave. And you can imagine an employer, say, using that. Of course, a real-life employer is going to take a whole bunch of different considerations into account. You can imagine that being at least a partial or even like tie-breaking kind of basis for a decision to give Rohit rather than Kristen the job. So what exactly, if we do think it's wrongful, many of us do, what exactly is wrongful about this inference? So one possibility might be that involves some kind of inaccurate stereotyping of groups. That's a common sort of argument against discrimination, or a certain problem given with many kind of paradigmatic other instances of discrimination. But the problem in this case is that it's not inaccurate. The premise 3 is completely true. It's we're accepting it for the sake of argument that it's say something well established by social scientists. So unlike many other kinds of sources of discrimination, many cases of discrimination, these cases of true accurate discrimination can't appeal to this kind of reason. But lots of the other kind of theories of discrimination do work in this case. So more utilitarian types focus on outcomes. So for instance, Lippert Rasmussen's sort of probably the biggest name to think about here. And you might think, well, just the wrongfulness here consists either of, say, the outcomes for groups as a whole. So, on average, if we allow this inference to be applied in decision making about jobs, women will wind up with fewer jobs. So you might think it's, in terms of outcome, worse for women as a class. Or if you want to focus on the outcome for the particular individual, say Kristen in this case, she's not necessarily entitled to a job, but she is entitled to fair treatment. And so you might think that there's something that goes wrong with the outcomes in that respect. So this again is a big picture theory of discrimination. That the wrong of discrimination consists in the different outcomes that happen to different groups and not in anything else. But other theories of discrimination focus on things other than just purely the outcomes. So for instance, this is my own attempt to kind of try and classify them. You might say that there's duty-based views. So the one I kind of have in mind is Benjamin Edelson's view that we have a duty to treat people as individuals. So in making decisions or predictions or just dealing with people in general, he thinks we have an obligation to sort of take properly into account the ways that they have exercised their autonomy in their own lives. And so he frames it as just a duty. And when you violate that duty, you've wronged them kind of even independently of any outcomes that might arise out of it. Or, and I take it these are intended to be separate than the duty-based views, are expressivist views. So the thought here is maybe an inference is, so I guess first talk about discrimination in general. When you discriminate against someone, you treat people differentially on the basis of, say, socially salient characteristics, you somehow communicate a message of them, some kind of negative or harmful message towards them. And so the distinct wrongfulness of the kind of this distinct characteristic of the feature that makes it like discriminatory in this case isn't the outcomes, but is simply the message itself. That's what makes it that's what it is, what makes it kind of discrimination in character. So I'm going to zoom in on expressivist views in particular. So these expressivist views in some ways are kind of powerful. They try to explain like all kinds of discrimination, as long as the kind of message can be connected to the act in the right way, it can extend to a lot of putative different cases of discrimination. And so, but there's many different possible expressivist views. So they would differ at least along 3 axes. So one thing that they would differ on is just what part of differential treatment or what exactly it is that's expressing the message. Then secondly, they might differ, say, on what exactly that message is. You can imagine it might be, saying something about a person's character, saying something about exclusion, saying, so on and so forth. And then the mechanism by which it expresses that message. So Deborah Hellman's sort of the leading figure in thinking about discrimination in these expressivist terms. So especially until like her answers to these questions go like this. So first of all, it's just she thinks it's the differential treatment itself that expresses the message. Secondly, when there is this differential treatment and it's discriminatory, it's expressing this demeaning message that some people are less worthy than others. So it somehow sends them it's discrimination when it sends the message that, say, people are less than equal. And when this is the case, the mechanism by which this message gets sent is a matter of social facts. So social conventions, social customs in a society sort of tell us what counts as demeaning or not. Okay. So one natural sort of objection that applies to, I think, expressivism is you might imagine a skeptic who says something like, who say makes a decision on the basis of a predicted characteristic, maybe like the Rohit example we just gave, and says, well, I'm using these facts in my decision making, but I didn't mean any disrespect. I'm just trying to, use my make as much money as possible for my company, or something like that. I'm not intentionally meaning any disrespect. So Hellman would have a reply here. This is, I think, somewhat, I'm putting words in her mouth here. I don't know if she explicitly says this, but it's easy to see how her view could respond to this. And she can just say, well, hey, like even if you didn't intend for it to be disrespectful, even if you didn't intend for it to communicate this message of exclusion, hey, social facts still apply. It's still reasonable to regard it as disrespectful. So this is, I think, a pretty good reply. But there are some lingering questions and problems that need to be solved with it, and ways in which it's not a completely optimal reply. So first of all, I think it's fair to ask, what are these social facts based upon? So are they really like the rock bottom here? Or is there something that, is there some other facts that say make those social facts more or less reasonable? Gets into the same kind of worries you might have about relativism or subjectivism in morality. In thinking about, is it really purely social facts that ground what counts as disrespectful? Or are there some, is it a mix of social conventions and more objective kind of moral or normative conventions? Secondly, what about new cases where there are no existing social norms? So for instance, norms obviously change over time. So in those cases, is it that we just can't disrespect people, that we can't, that our behavior or actions or differential treatment can't express any disrespect? We probably don't want to say that. Thirdly, this expressivist reply kind of invites the following question. Well, if you want to get rid of discrimination, well, one way to do it on this view would be to just change our social norms rather than change, our differential treatment. If we just change the norms, it'll suddenly, the differential treatment will cease to have that meaning anymore. And finally, kind of related to all three of those things, this expressivist way of responding to the skeptic, I think creates new problems with algorithmic decision making. So, there's more things that say someone like Hellman could say, but at first glance, if the decision is made purely by algorithms, especially algorithms working in, say, an unsupervised way, discovering new patterns of data on their own, it's a little bit hard to see how they can express a negative message in the same along this kind of social line. If these algorithms wind up uncovering these patterns and using them in their application, in their decision-making processes, it's at least, I think, a bit of a stretch for expressivists like Hellman to say that the algorithm expresses exactly the same kind of disrespect as a human being making the same decision in full awareness of the social consequences would. So all these things make me think that there's some way that there should be some, there's some room for improvement on Hellman's view here. And so this leads me to start thinking about philosophy of probability. And so I'm going to use this idea of what I'll call an interpretive shift, and I'll say more about that as we go. So to begin, we'll get a little bit distant from discrimination for a few minutes. Just consider the following examples of statements involving probabilities or statistics. So we've got snow is more likely in January than July in Toronto. Pretty plausible. The Knicks have a 25% probability of winning this championship this year. If you roll a fair six-sided die, it's equally likely to land on any of the six numbers. So they're different in surface form, but on the whole, all of them involve probabilities and statistics in different ways. So if philosophers of probability or statistics, the central debate of their subfield of philosophy is to understand exactly what these probability or statistics statements are getting at. Like, what's the right way of understanding what it is a probability statement fundamentally means? Like, what sort of properties, what sort of things does it track? And I'll mention probably the three major views. So, according to frequentists, probability statements are actually pretty thin. All they do is indicate long-run kind of relative frequencies of events. So if you flip a coin, and if we say that it's, what it means to say that it's 50% chance that it's going to hit heads, all they're saying is that if you run enough of these events, 50% of them will come up heads. Bayesian epistemic views understand probabilities subjectively in terms of rational belief, in terms of evidence available to people. And so they say, they understand it in terms of, there's roughly a 50% chance that the strength of my rational belief in this proposition, that it will be heads, should be 0.5. Same with the proposition that it should be tails. Finally, there's propensity views. So probability statements imply the presence of some kind of objective property within the system in question that causes the event to occur. So Charles Peirce, the 19th century American philosopher, gives a kind of early propensity account. So says, I am then to define the meaning of the statement that the probability that if a die be thrown from a dice box, it will turn up a number divisible by 3 is 1/3. So the statement means that the die has a certain would be, and to say that the die has a would be is to say that it has a property quite analogous to any habit that a man might have. So in the propensity theories, there's something in the system that's causing it to behave in a certain way. Okay, so my suggestion, and I think this is somewhat new, these different theories of probability are often presented as kind of competing theories. I doubt few people would want to say that every probability statement should be understood purely in one of those terms. But there's another question about kind of linguistic interpretation that I think has been underexplored. So if you take a given probability statement, it seems like different probability statements at least tend us towards different kinds of interpretations. So for instance, our first statement, snow is more likely in January than in July in Toronto, is probably, I think more naturally understood as like a frequentist claim. The Knicks have 25% probability seems kind of Bayesian, like about subjective knowledge, like based upon what I know, here's what I think. And finally, when you think about a die, it's more tempting to say, well, there's something in the die that's producing the 1/6 probability. So different kinds of probability statements, I think, lend themselves to different kinds of interpretations. So what facts then explain why some probability statements are best interpreted in frequentist terms, others in, say, Bayesian terms, and others in propensity terms? Well, it's probably a mix of things, And these might actually still underdetermine the correct interpretation. There might still be some at the end of the day that are ambiguous. But to the extent that they are interpreted, the extent that a particular interpretation of a statement is warranted, it's likely driven by speaker intention, but not just by speaker intention, also just by the semantics of the statement, by the pragmatics and broader context. Okay, so all of these can affect the way in which a probability statement should be interpreted. Now, what I'm going to do is describe 4 particular, we'll call them drivers, that push the interpretation of a probability statement in some particular direction, towards one of those theories over the other. Okay. So, and actually, maybe before I do that, just in case we want to tie this quickly back to discrimination, where I'm ultimately going with this is there's something comparatively neutral about frequentist interpretations, and something quite a bit more loaded about propensity interpretations, okay, which will lend itself more to expressing a kind of discriminatory or demeaning message. Okay, so like I said, 4 drivers that affect how a probability statement might be interpreted. So the first is the epistemic role. Like, how is this probability statement getting used in inference? So you might distinguish between, say, prediction. So it's being used in some sort of, prediction is or a backwards, I should say, or a backwards looking kind of context. Lends itself to kind of a frequentist or Bayesian interpretation. Whereas making decisions or more forward-looking things tend to a more propensity interpretation. So for instance, compare looking at historical data, 30% of March days in Toronto have precipitation. That's pretty frequentist. On the other hand, you should bring an umbrella today because there's a 30% chance of rain. Sort of suggests, I think, more of a propensity kind of interpretation of what the weather system's doing. Second is individualization. So if a probability claim or statistical claim is about groups, then we tend more towards a frequentist interpretation. But if it's about individual persons, we're more likely to make a kind of propensity claim. So for instance, compare 20% of patients with this cancer tend to relapse in 5 years. That's, I think, more easily read as a frequentist claim. Whereas you have a 20% chance of relapse invites more of a propensity claim. Say there's something inside the person that's driving them to a 20% chance.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Is the point here that, like, you want to say that those two statements also express the same thing? They have the same meaning? Like, these are two ways of saying the same thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, in this case, yes.
Okay.
Not all. I don't think all of my examples quite match up so nicely, but this one I think is intended to. So individualization of events. So if a probability statement sort of concerns a one-off event, then we tend more towards propensity. Whereas if it's describing so the overall set of patterns across a series of events, then we tend more towards a frequentist interpretation. So again, these two are totally different, but it's hard to come up with a matching example here. This atom has a 25% chance of decaying right now. It's a paradigmatic kind of propensity case. Whereas this coin will tend to come up 50% of the time over 100 flips, skews a little more frequentist. And finally, the use of kind of the, when the probability claim concerns sort of essentializing categories. So any category that tracks some kind of essential property, something that's intrinsic to someone or sort of necessarily part of their identity, tends to skew us towards propensity readings. Whereas categories tracking non-essential properties, tend comparatively at least to be more frequentist. So compare women are more likely to take parental leave with employees hired in Q4 are more likely to take parental leave. I think the former tends to more naturally be read in a propensity kind of way, whereas the latter tends to be read in more of a frequentist way. So, okay, so what we've got then are some drivers, and they, if my argument's right so far, drive the interpretation of probability statements, say towards the frequentist interpretations or propensity interpretations. So what I'm going to do now is map this back to context of decision-making and discrimination. So let's go back to our paradigmatic example. So Kristen is a woman, Rohit is a man. Women are more likely than men to take parental leave. Therefore, Kristen is more likely than Rohit to take parental leave, using that as a basis for a decision to give Rohit rather than Kristen the job. So our skeptic from earlier, who looked at inferences like these and wanted to say, well, I don't mean anything like disrespectful. I don't mean to send any sort of demeaning message. My thought is that they're imagining that there is something to the skeptic's claim. What they're doing is imagining these as purely frequentist claims. Frequentist claims, I think, if that were the right way of understanding that, would be comparatively neutral. But the trouble is that if my arguments about drivers are correct, they're driven towards being propensity claims. It's a mistake for the skeptic to think that they ever could reasonably be read as frequentist claims. That the context of the situation is always going to drive them to be propensity claims. And as we'll see in a little bit, if they're to be read as propensity claims, that's why they're so harmful. So just kind of checking to see how the different drivers are present here. Well, epistemic role, obviously it's used for decision, and my argument earlier is right, that pushes us towards propensity interpretation. It's about a single person, at least ultimately it's used to make a decision about a particular person, so at least in the conclusion, if not the third premise. It's about one event in this case, the question of whether to give one person a job or whether one person is going to take parental leave. And there's an essentializing kind of category present, like gender. So all of these kind of shift us towards propensity-based interpretation. Now, I don't think propensity, this debate between frequentist and Bayesian and propensity views in the statistics is a comparatively dry one. But I think if we connect it to discrimination, it gets a little more alive. So when we compare propensity interpretations with frequentist interpretations, I think they certainly risk expressing more harmful messages. So to begin with, there's a worry about sort of misplaced individualization. If people are treated as individuals, they're treated not as individuals anymore. It invites sort of stigma or fatalism, to say, to describe someone in frequentist terms, it's comparatively neutral evidence, but to just make a statistical statement connected to them in propensity terms sort of invites a form of fatalism. And relatedly, it distorts kind of how they perceive, how they others would reasonably perceive their own responsibility and agency. And it's, I think, adds further essentialization. It sort of suggests that these traits in people are less removable from them than they otherwise would have been. Okay, so one objection that might come to mind is that so far this picture doesn't explain kind of asymmetrical intuitions within categories. So for instance, say men versus women. The example we've been working with so far is about women being more likely to take parental leave. But of course, these statements also involve men sometimes. And typically, although not always, we sort of have the intuition that they're that they communicate a less harmful message when they're about privileged sides of, say, the gender spectrum than not privileged sides, and that they communicate more of a harmful message when these decisions are made about women than they are made about men. But so far, my view doesn't really have an account for that. All the drivers that we've said so far seem to apply equally, say, to men or women. So how to explain that? So one possible answer, of course, would be that it doesn't need explanation, that we're driven to propensity and we're driven to a harmful message equally in statistical statements involving men and statistical inferences involving men as we are with women. But if you do think there's an asymmetry here, there's two possible answers that you might have. One, of course, is that there might be other drivers. My list isn't exhaustive, only presented 4 drivers, but there's surely many other contextual things. And maybe those are relevant to those kind of asymmetries. But also you might just say that majorities, or say like men, are shielded from the harms of propensity interpretations. That even though, say, a similar kind of decision made about men does lend itself to a propensity interpretation, there might be some respect in which the demeaning or harmful message that's the result of that propensity interpretation might be blocked. So we need to go into more thought about that, but that's how two ways that you might that this framework might still give rise to kind of treating men and women differently on this score. Okay, so what I want to do now is sort of situate this, to kind of wrap up, situate this back in the discrimination, different proposals about discrimination discussed at the beginning of the lecture. So far, If we were to sum up, linguistic facts, what I've been arguing is that linguistic facts, so things like semantics and pragmatics and all these different drivers, are often enough to explain why the use of statistical generalization expresses a negative message. So how does this, what I've given is basically a mechanism by which these statistical inferences about people that are, even when they're true, express this negative message. So how does this fit in with other views of this message and other views of discrimination more generally? So first of all, like my mechanism here wouldn't replace any of those, the first two live competing theories we talked about at the beginning. The harm-based theory, where the harm of discrimination just consists in like the impacts on people, the outcomes on people. And it also probably doesn't replace the duty-based theories either, like Edelson's duty to treat people as individuals. Those things are still going on completely independently in many cases of discrimination and are independent explanations of the wrong that's found in discrimination. So this mechanism, if it's kind of competing with anything, is competing with other expressivist views, like Hellman's view. But I actually don't think my mechanism really fully replaces Hellman's theory either. So again, if you're kind of comparing the two theories, my theory sort of says, or my mechanism says that the reason that differential treatment in these cases expresses something kind of negative is because the statistical kind of claims that are made wind up having a propensity interpretation. And that happens purely in virtue of like semantic and pragmatic and other linguistic kind of facts. Whereas Hellman's theory says that when statistical kind of reasoning about people has this negative message, it happens in virtue of social facts. What we've decided implicitly or explicitly writ large as a society, what counts as harmful or demeaning. And so I think those two theories can still exist in kind of parallel to each other, but there are differences between them. So for instance, the mechanism I proposed would cover cases that Hellman's theory doesn't cover. So for instance, where there aren't social norms already, this theory can step in. And likewise, I think it gives an explanation. There's a way of sort of building it into Hellman's theory. So Hellman's theory, like I just said, says that it's social facts that explain why there's a demeaning message. But that still sort of demands an explanation of why social norms tend to gravitate towards treating some kinds of differential treatment as demeaning and not others. And of course, one partial explanation for that might be just might be what language makes possible or doesn't make possible. But of course, social norms do definitely help to determine what treatment counts as demeaning as well. Okay, so to quickly sum up. So the one sentence kind of version of the talk. So if the negative message in discriminatory decision-making, when it's based on true group information, like in our case of parental leave, isn't driven purely by moral or social facts, but it's also driven just kind of inevitably by linguistic facts limitations. So thanks for coming to my talk.